stories about your family, starting probably, I don't know, do you have any significant family history from like way back then, a while ago?
Yeah, I mean, so on my grandma's side is kind of where a lot of our family history is. She was an only child, born and raised only child, never met her father. But the really interesting part about her story is that she was born in China because she's Jewish. So my great-grandma Hilda Fechner was living in Germany during World War II, and they had to immigrate to China during World War II, and that's where my grandma was born. So she was living in China for 2 years, and then moved to the States after that, and was raised in the States. She was raised in Minnesota, and so that's kind of where her upbringing was. But I just thought it was really cool, figuring that out, growing up, that, yes, I'm Jewish, but there's so much more to just saying that I'm Jewish. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of oppression that she experienced, and then we think and we feel like my grandma's dad, which would be my great-grandfather, was a part of the German army of some sorts, and so I think that there was some cultural differences there, and that's why he never really came around when she was born and stuff, because culturally it just wasn't acceptable. And so she never really got to have a relationship with him or meet him. And so that's kind of the start of it, living in China for 2 years. So I guess the question is she Chinese?
Do you know why they decided to move to China though?
Well, during World War II, there was a lot of oppression in Germany. A lot of, they were snatching up Jews by the minute, separating them from families, and it just was a very toxic environment to live in. I don't know really details other than the fact that that's where they had to immigrate to. And China, I don't know why. I really don't know why they went to China. It's like they could have gone anywhere, and then went all the way across the world, right? Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, my great-grandmother died when she was early 20s of lung cancer, so I never got to meet her or anything like that. But I do, the cool thing is, so my wedding ring is my great-great-great-grandmother's ring. So it's my great-grandma's mom's ring. And this is kind of cool, I sing, and I'm kind of the only person in my family that sings. Like, my mom doesn't sing, my grandma didn't really sing, but my great-great-grandmother, she was an opera singer, and she taught piano too. So that's kind of another added piece to my history as well. She lived in the States, and they immigrated and were able to escape World War II, which is great. Very strong German accent. My mom says her impression of her grandma, my grandma's mom, was that she was very stoic, so kind of scared her a little bit as a kid, never really got close to her, because sometimes that it was kind of the nature of the German culture, a little kind of strong, so
just a little,
a little bit scary. So that's it's just really interesting, because even seeing my grandma, as she was kind of going about her life, she really carried a lot of shame, and she carried a lot of fear as well. And I think there's something to be said there in what she went through as a kid, and maybe what her mom went through, and kind of what had been passed down through her to her as a child. I mean, I think there's a correlation there between maybe what they went through and even shame in the Jewish culture, because they were so heavily shamed for their beliefs, for their culture. I mean, they were ridiculed and persecuted, and if we don't address that can be a generational thing that's passed down. We will pass it down to every generation. And up until her deathbed, my grandmother was very afraid and very, always felt like she had to try to achieve or to be good enough. And I think that is really a crazy cultural just transition from her mother to her, and that's something that, we have to recognize, so that we don't let that come over ourselves or come over myself, So anyways, that's another part of just her journey and what kind of I observed as I'm even talking about where did that come from. And it most likely probably came down from her mother down to her, you know, always being afraid, always kind of, is someone going to come get us? Is someone going to come snatch us up? So there's always that in the back of your mind that like your religious beliefs could cause you death and hostility, you know, which is kind of crazy. So
Yeah. So then, after they moved to Minnesota, do you know what they did there? Or
I know that my grandma's mom worked. She was worked full time. And I know a lot more about my grandma's history. You know, she was a professional ballet dancer, so she did a lot of the arts. You know, was very heavily involved in that. So for years, she did professional ballet, traveled to like New York, and did all of that stuff. But was raised on her own. I mean, just her mom and her. There's only child. She was very close to her mom, so when her mom did die, it was really hard on her. She was only maybe mid to late 20s. So, but yeah, in Minnesota, I think her mom just worked full time and took care of my grandma Kathy, you know. I don't know a whole lot about her. It'd be actually a really interesting conversation to have with probably my grandpa, since my grandma just passed away, but just to know a little more about what did they do in that season? What was she like? What did they do? But my grandma's always been very independent, and I think that's probably because her mom was really independent. Just kind of took care of each other. Mm-hmm. So they were raised in a Christian home, so they religiously went to church every Sunday, things like that, but not Jewish. So they're Jewish by culture, but not necessarily religion, which I think is interesting too, you know. And so but my grandma was a dancer. She did all the cool things, you know, traveling the world, doing performances and stuff. Then she met my grandpa in Minnesota, got married, and then, stopped dancing and then started her family. So, yeah. So any other questions or anything like that? The language, yeah. So my great-grandmother had a very strong German accent. My grandma didn't have any type of accent or anything, and they didn't speak Hebrew, I believe. I believe she was fluent in German. So I think in that time there actually were probably a lot of German Jews. I mean, German and Jewish are actually very close culture. It's kind of intertwined because it's in a similar vicinity. So she definitely spoke German. And, that's where my mom, her impression of my great-grandmother was kind of afraid of her, and because she just had this thick German accent, it was really hard to understand her and to kind of sense any kind of softness to her. You know, she wasn't very soft, but, I mean, with what she went through, I don't think there was much room to be a very soft person, you know, with all the things that she had experienced. So that's the only bit of language, I think maybe a language barrier that was there, is what my mom's experience was, 2 generations down, not being able to really, But I do know that my grandma was very, also kind of hard in a sense, very I guess you could call her a prophet perceiver, very strict and firm. And so that was obviously taken down from her mother. So my mom would tell me, she's like, if you thought grandma was hard and stern, you should have seen her mom, I mean, that's kind of where she had cultivated that and learned that. So, yeah, so German, which is crazy. And then my grandpa is German as well. So, yeah, so there's all of that mixed up in me.
At what point did your family feel American?
At what point did my family feel American? Wow. That is a really good question. I would say probably for my grandma and for, at her point, probably sometime as she began elementary school and had community, and then, started going to church, finding their people, finding their culture within culture type of thing. Yeah. I think that's probably when they felt, American. And the interesting thing too is that my grandma is very, that she had a lot of pride in America, was never to, she never thought anything wrong of America. And, religious voter, voted every year, or every election term, things like that. So very involved in the political system in America, which a lot of people who do immigrate to America don't feel that connection.
Yeah.
So I thought that's really interesting as well. My great-grandmother, I don't know a whole lot about maybe when she felt like she was an American or kind of claimed this as her home. But from what I can see from my grandma, it was never any kind of this weird, like, I don't belong here.
Yeah.
I think she's always wanted to visit Israel, my grandmother, but I don't think she was ever able to. So that's something maybe we'll get to do later on in life, just because it's such a huge part of our DNA,
Yeah.
And it would be cool to just go and see a whole new country. I don't know if you know this, but if you can prove your Jewish bloodline, Israel is a country that will actually pay for you to move to Israel.
Wow.
And house you to become an Israeli citizen. They're very big on bringing the Jewish people back to their homeland. They are, cool. Yeah, so they will full on pay for you, pay for your citizenship, and make sure that you're housed and everything if you are of Jewish culture. I know, I was like, wow. But I don't really want to, I love being here, so I do love being an American, I love being Jewish, but I don't know if I would ever want to live in Israel,
Yeah.
I heard it's very different, so, but, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
You can talk and just edit it out.
Okay, so what were the results of your DNA? What was it called again?
The Ancestry. So I took the Ancestry test, I want to say last Christmas.
Yep.
So I'm 25% British, and then I'm 12% Jewish, and then it was 40% Scandinavian.
Okay.
Which
Norwegian,
right? Yeah. So I was kind of like, wow, Scandinavian. What is that? So I still kind of want to explore that a little bit. Where do I get the Scandinavian from? Which I'm assuming it's from dad and mom. There's some parts of Scandinavian both because that's a pretty high percentage. I know that 25% British is from Dave. I know that's. Meeting his dad was Al. Strong British accents, of course. And I've actually been to London, so I felt like I belonged there. I was like, oh, I love this. I could do the accent. It was great. It's actually weird because I've always loved the British accent, the culture, things like that. So it's kind of cool doing the test and figuring out parts of who you are genetically can kind of click, So the 25% British and then the 12% Jewish is obviously from my grandmother, and it's actually Northern Jewish, so there's different regions of Jew, I guess. I wasn't aware of that. So that was really interesting. I loved the Ancestry test, and it even shows you the regions as to where you're from on the map and stuff.
That's cool.
So I know my grandfather's side is strong Scandinavian, so I'm sure some of that is coming from his side as well. His parents' maiden name was Audi, so that's a very Scandinavian, Norwegian type name. So, anyways, yeah, that's that so far.
Okay. Do you know if any of your family was affected by some of the big events in American? Obviously, World War II, and
right.
then the Great Depression was sometime after that. I don't.
Well, that was before, right?
Oh.
No, it's
Are you
okay.
talking about the Vietnam War?
Vietnam War?
Stuff like that. Yeah.
Actually, my grandfather was drafted for the Vietnam War.
Oh.
He was drafted for it, but I think he worked more IT and stuff, so more behind the scenes. He was in the Air Force for 4 years or 4 or 5 years, so he was active military, active duty. So the Vietnam War definitely was something that he was specifically affected by because he was a little bit older at that time. Other than that, my grandparents were very heavily involved. They were business owners, so they were very affected by any kind of political office, any kind of political party, or different legislations that were being passed. As a private business owner, they were definitely just very involved politically on voting and educating themselves. So there's a lot of different historical things that had taken place in the 70s and 80s Their biggest business booming time was, I would say, probably, throughout the late 80s and 90s. I believe Reagan was in office, right, during that time, and that was a really great time for him as a business owner, just for whatever political legislations he was passing. I don't know specifics, but I do know that a part in American history like really played a huge toll on just their livelihood and stuff. And then my grandpa he was a farmer actually for years. He was a FFA farmer, like Future Farmers of America in high school.
In California.
Yeah, actually in Wisconsin. So that's how him and my grandma met, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Kind of a blind date, I guess they went on. Like their friends set them up on a blind date. So cute to think years ago. They actually had celebrated, they were married 53 years before she passed. So, but Future Farmers of America, him and his brother ran their own company in like Wisconsin area, like farming and raising pigs, raising cattle, things like that. And it was when he married my grandma and they started a family that he just really felt led to go to California and kind of start his own life with his family, things like that. And that was a big deal because his whole family was in Wisconsin. Like that was the hub with all his cousins, his brothers, So that's what led my parents to, or my family to California. Yeah. And then that's where like my mom went to high school, and they were in West Covina area. And so that's kind of where they landed, and then just everything else took place. And so I've been born and raised California because of that, which is pretty crazy because just one decision or one turn of events can affect every single thing that is in your livelihood. Like one decision from your parents or one thing here, like let's move here instead of here, can completely alter the trajectory of our lives, which is really wild.